circulatory system because I can't circulate that back to my tissues. So we need to do another circulatory system. Why don't we send it back to the same place we got oxygen? So the pulmonary arteries are going to take this deoxygenated blood rich in carbon dioxide, send it over to the pulmonary capillaries, and in the pulmonary capillaries, we're going to take CO2 and diffuse it into the alveoli, and you do this. And then you inhale oxygen, and the oxygen comes to the pulmonary veins back to the left side of the heart, and we do it again. That's why they call it a circulatory system. So the systemic circulation is the bottom, pulmonary circulation is at the top. Okay? And we just go through it again and again. Now, who are all the players in this respiratory system? So here we're going to take a look and we're going to see that we have the trachea, which is your windpipe. You then have the bronchial tree, which is now just like a tree that has branches and the branches get smaller. The bronchial tree branch off from the trachea, and then those branches go off to these things that anatomists looked at that and they say, hey, what do we call those things that look like grapes? I know. We'll call them the things that look like grapes. They were talking a different language, and we call these the alveoli. Alveolus for singular, alveoli for plural. That's the functional unit of the respiratory system. Those who are in pathology or who are looking at tissues, it's the functional tissue. They call it the parenchyma. It's the functional. Everything else is supporting that alveoli because that's where the gas exchange occurs. And then you have these lungs, which is basically this encapsulated structure that has all the alveoli and connective tissue and puts them all together in two sides between on the other side of the heart. And then the pleura, which we'll talk about, that helps lubricate this system. And then I'll talk about the diaphragm and some other clinical things about it. So, trachea. Let's talk about the windpipe. Okay. So here we have that trachea, your windpipe. At the very top, the thing that kind of looks like a bow tie, that's the thyroid gland. It got its name because thyroid comes from this derivation of shield. It kind of looks like a shield. So if you put your hand here in front of your neck and go, just hum, and you feel it kind of vibrate, okay, that's your thyroid cartilage, and inside of that are your vocal folds. They're vibrating, that's what allows you to sing, talk, make a sound, those things are vibrating. That is what is shown right there. And now we got this trachea that comes down, this windpipe, and it has these C-shaped cartilaginous rings. And what we're going to see with the trachea and the branching in the bronchial tree is it has all this supporting tissue to make sure, blast, I knew I forgot to get a balloon. No one happens to have a balloon on. No? Okay. Pretend I'm blowing up a balloon. You blow it up, and I'm holding it, so now you got this balloon that's loaded up, and I let go. What happens to the balloon? It collapses, and I saw this, and it like spirals, right? It collapses on itself. When the air rushes out, the structure, the container, will want to collapse upon itself. So God then said, well, I can't have that happen every time they breathe. That's not very efficient. So let's put a skeletal structure there. So every time you exhale, there's a skeletal structure, but we won't make it bone, we'll make it cartilage. So they have these C-shaped cartilaginous rings. In cross-section, there's the trachea, and outline, there's that C-shaped ring. And then you're like, well, why is it C-shaped? Why is it in a circle? Because the trachea is your airway, and behind it is your esophagus. So the trachea is your air pipe, the esophagus is your food pipe. And so when you then take that really big bite of that peanut butter sandwich going between sessions, you need to make sure that there's room for it to push in a little bit on the airway, and that's why it's C-shaped. So here we have now the first branching. We call this the right primary bronchus. It's what ventilates the right lung. This term ventilates means you're providing air to. And then that right primary bronchus supplies the entire right lung. In other words, if you block that right primary bronchus, nothing gets in or out of that lung. Okay, so for example, a cancerous tumor that hugs and squeezes that right main stem bronchus, if it squeezes it almost to occlusion, air's not getting in or out, so now you're only using one lung. He was eating a pretzel. Do you remember this? And President George W. Bush was eating a pretzel. He was sitting on his couch. He was lying down, and it went down, and someone had to help him and give him a Heimlich maneuver and get him going so he could breathe again. Because where did the pretzel go? Right at that place behind your thyroid cartilage where those two folds, they call it the glottis, it went and plugged it. And if you plug it, then you're not breathing. And that's not good. Okay, so now, let's take a look now at something here. We call this the secondary bronchi or lobar bronchi because they supply lobes. You have a right and left lung. Well, there's 3 lobes on the right and 2 lobes on the left. So basically you've got a superior, middle, and an inferior lobe. And though you have a upper, middle, and inferior secondary bronchus, and the same for the left, except there's only 2, an upper and a lower. And so the secondary bronchi supply those different segments, those different lobes. So let's say you have a tumor that squeezes a secondary bronchus. Then you only affect that lobe. Now, if we now see, if you have primary and secondary, the next is tertiary. And they call these segmental bronchi because they supply a part of a lobe that's called a bronchopulmonary segment. And these tertiary segments then supply just parts of each of the lobes that are part of the lung. Now, the beautiful thing the way nature, I always say nature, I should say, though, I'm at BYU, I can say, I'm not at Godless University, Utah right now. God made these lungs. Basically, you made it so that you could take a part of a whole lung or a part of a lung, and you could still get ventilation and perfusion of blood to these other segments, so you could surgically remove one part and the rest of the lung would be okay. Who's this?
Pope.
I love the Pope, Pope Francis, okay? So Pope Francis, when he was 21, got a lung infection, and part of the lung infection, they said, okay, we need to surgically take out. So they took out one whole lobe of Pope Francis's lung. And is he okay? Yeah. That was years ago. And he's still able to breathe. Why? Because of the redundancy in ventilation, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, all the way down to bronchioles, and also the way that we perfuse. Blood going in and out of the tissues. Okay? How we doing? Now, that was fun, wasn't it? Let's do it again. Except this time, we're going to take a look as if we're a scope. And we're going to take a scope. This doesn't look very comfortable, does it? And we're going to take a scope, an endoscope. It's basically a flexible tube with a camera and a light at the end. We're going to feed it down in your mouth, down your pharynx, see that glottis, hum, so it opens, and then put it between the 2 vocal folds. We're now in your windpipe, and it looks like this. Okay, so now in a sense, you're at the very top of the back of your tongue. You just walk to the edge of your tongue, and you're looking down. So this is what it looks like. And so this is your trachea. And you see these ridges that are along the side? Those are the C-shaped cartilaginous rings. What are their purpose? Whenever you exhale, to make sure your airway stays open, stays patent. Let's feed this down a little bit farther. And we see, well, before we do that, you see there's these shadows you can see, where we've got the left and right primary bronchus, and the little keel-shaped thing in the middle is called the carina. So we go down, and so here we now have it, where the carina is this, and often it's used as an endoscopic term or a radiographic term. It's where the bifurcation of the trachea happens. That bifurcation, it's a fancy word for it forks. So where the trachea forks, that little keel-shaped thing is the carina, and you can see the left primary bronchus and the right primary bronchus. But remember, this is a hollow tree branch. And just in your mind, think of a tree branch, thick, and the other successive branches are not quite as thick, and the successive branches are even less thick, all the way down to leaves. So now we take a look at this right side, and we're already starting to see the secondary bronchi. So we go in, and now we're in this right upper lobe, and we can now see these tertiary segments going into these bronchopulmonary segments. And it just keeps branching. And what happens to the diameter of these airways? They get smaller. What happens to the thickness of the walls? They get thinner. What happens to the amount of cartilage? It starts getting thinner and less and less and less until finally the airways are only connective tissue, elastic tissue, and we get down to the functional tissue, okay? So here we now have the trachea and bronchial tree. I'm going to take one airway, and there's one airway, and then I'm going to take and scoop out the inside of the airway, ta-da, and that's what the cells look like. They really don't look like that. It's just a nice colorful picture. But what happens is the brown line at the bottom is a basement membrane for a type of tissue that we call epithelium. And epithelium lines all the outside of the body and the inside of every tube or organ. And it's a tissue which is made up of a bunch of different cells. And so all the cells that are kind of tan-shaped have these things that look like spiky hair coming up. Like you just finished out of a shower and you do the towel thing and the hair goes up. Those are called cilia. Now the purpose of cilia is they move stuff. And now these cells that are colored green and they've got those white vacuoles in them, they're called goblet cells. They got that name because early histologists looked and they look, it kind of looks like a champagne or wine goblet. We'll call them goblet cells. They make mucus. The type of mucus like, I won't do it, we're inside, like you spit out, okay? An expectorant, you hork a loogie, that's the type of mucus we're talking about. Now, the reason why we do this is that we live in Utah. What's the weather like? It's dry and a little dusty, and recently a little smoky. So what happens is every time you go and you inhale this wonderful amount of oxygen and everything that the oxygen keeps, which are dust, little particles, germs, and they all come in. And so God said, we need to make sure we prevent those from getting all the way down to the alveoli, so we need to stop it. So let's put flypaper lining the inside of all of these airways. We don't call it flypaper, we call it mucus. And so these green goblet cells make mucus that lines the whole top. And so you inhale dust and it goes just like flypaper. But now what do? Well, I gotta get rid of this stuff. You're gonna cough. So we need to get that stuff from down in the roots of the lungs up. And so they call this the mucociliary elevator. Isn't that not the coolest name? And what it does is these things, have you ever done, so if you go to a rock concert and everyone's close to the stage and everyone's pushing up against the stage, and then you'll get the occasional person that you'll see the bouncer over here and the bouncer over there. I'm saying this as if I've done it. I'm a science teacher, I've never done this, but my sister did. So what she did is she's at the stage, she looked, the bouncers were far enough away, she jumped up on the stage like this, and then she jumped, and she landed on everyone in the audience. I love how some people are like, people do that all the time. And what does everyone in the audience do? Bingo, they put their arms up. And they do what's called body surfing. And they push them along until there's no people, and then they fall on the ground. The mucociliary elevator is body surfing except in your airways. Okay, you inhale this stuff, dust, germs, hits in the mucus flypaper, the cilia, move it to the back of the throat, and then you're like talking and things are great, and then you're like, And so I was saying $5 and you continue the conversation. Okay? And what is it? It's mucus filled with dust or germs. So, Joseph Smith, early days of the church, they're having all these meetings. Everyone in these meetings is chewing tobacco, spitting on the ground, they're smoking, it's smoky inside the rooms, and Emma says, yeah, this isn't cool. I don't think she said that. But translation in 2021, this isn't cool, we shouldn't be doing this. She talks to Joseph, Joseph goes to the Lord, we get section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Tobacco is not to be used for the body, it's supposed to be used for cattle, and so forth. And you don't smoke. And so for years, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were known, we don't smoke. And then as time went on, people were like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do this, until like a century later, science then says, yeah, smoking's not very good for you. You know why? Because what it does is it immobilizes those cilia, so the cilia can't work. And then it causes those goblet cells to make a crap ton of mucus. And that mucus now clogs airways, but the cilia don't work, so now the mucus is trapping inside there, and we can't get it out. And so what do smokers do? We call it a smoker's cough. And then they cough and they cough. And why are they coughing? They're trying to force all that mucus from the airways up. And what is the mucus trapping? Germs and bacteria. And it allows for this wonderful thing of infection to happen. And then those other noxious chemicals, take a look at all those other blue cells, which are They're basically called basal cells, but they're stem cells that make either goblet cells or the cilia cells. So the cilia cells, all the cilia is immobile, and then they stop working. You get a process of metaplasia where one cell was supposed to be this, and now it becomes something else. And over a long period, and I mean long period of time, when it comes to non-small carcinoma, usually it's like a 30-pack year history, you have now gone from driving northbound in the I-15 to driving north in the southbound lane, and you start smoking when you're 18, but it's 3 in the morning. And you just keep driving and you keep driving, you're still smoking, Now you're 30 years old. It's now 4:30 in the morning. How many cars are on the road? A lot more. So, but you keep driving and you keep driving, so you're still smoking, and now you're in your 40s and 50s, it's now 7 o'clock in the morning, how much traffic is on there? Still doesn't mean, because you're like, well, I heard George Burns smoked cigars till he was 95 and he didn't die of lung cancer. For every George Burns, there is a lot more that died of cancer. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it is the number one, it is the risk factor if you're going to get non-small cell carcinoma, is if you smoke. Now, we take a look at those alveolar sacs. We've gone all the way down to these things that look like grapes, and that's where the gas exchange is occurring. And so what happens now is we're going to take one of those alveoli and blow it up. We have this thing called an alveolus, and what is its interface? There's something called a pulmonary capillary. What's pulmonary? Whenever I say pulmonary, what does that mean? Lungs. That's why the lung doctor is called pulmonary arteries and veins, and why the capillary, where this blood vessel is so, the diameter is so thin that we are now looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 10 microns in diameter. It's really small. That means a red blood cell, which is usually 7 to 8 micrometers in diameter, are now single file going through this pulmonary capillary. And what are we doing with the blood going there? We have this carbon dioxide that's coming down. It is in the pulmonary capillaries at a high concentration, and like a fart, will diffuse from high to low concentration. I just thought I'd say that because most people recognize what it's like. If I'm here and someone's over there and they have a flatulent event, eventually it's going to make it over this way. Because flatus goes from a high to low concentration. So the carbon dioxide fart is in high concentration and then diffuses through the endothelium and the type 1 pneumocytes into the alveolus, and then you do this. And you exhale. And then you inhale, and oxygen comes in. And now oxygen is in high concentration in the alveolus, but it's low concentration inside the pulmonary capillary. So the oxygen diffuses across, and the pulmonary vein brings it back to the left atrium. And what happens? This just happens every single heartbeat. This is what occurs. And the gases are exchanging. And this is the purpose of the lungs. So the trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, all the bronchioles and everything, the whole purpose is to get air down to that. Yeah?
Can you explain how it, I mean, I've only ever been explained that it's a thin membrane, but how is it actually exchanging and never, like, outside to the rest of the body? Why only to...
Gotcha. So basically, how come, if we take a look at this, how come oxygen and carbon dioxide are going that way and not the other way? Is that what part of the question is? This is an incomplete illustration, because what we see is if the alveolus is here, and how there's this, almost like this is outside the Wilkinson Center, and this is a road, and there's this little place where people are getting in and out of cars. The only difference is where this capillary is coursing is surrounded at all sides by these alveoli. So gas is diffusing every single direction. Left, right, up, down, obliquely, gas is exchanging. And why? That the red cells are called endothelial cells, and those tan cells are called type 1 pneumocytes. And we needed to make, for this to be an efficient membrane, so thin as possible, to make it easy for these gases to exchange, that these cells went in and had a joint fence. So instead of two neighbors building two fences side by side, because they both wanted a fence, they're like, why don't we just go in 50-50 and build one fence? So they share a basement membrane. And that's actually in nature a very efficient thing that we only see at a few places. The lungs and the glomerulus and the kidney are some of the only places we see that we need to have this very thin membrane. And then these cells have a phospholipid bilayer, the cell membrane, that is extremely picky about what goes through it. And really the only things that can go through it without a door, in a sense, to act like a ghost and go through it, are gases that are non-charged and non-polar, and steroid hormones. Everything else, to get through, it actually has to have a door. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are the ghosts. If you're something else like I want to go through that, I actually have to go through a door. We call those protein transporters. Okay? 1 and then 2, and then we'll save the rest of the questions till the end. Please.
What happens when an athlete increases its capacity to take on oxygen?
Gotcha. So basically now we're looking at, what about athletes? And you take a look at someone who's able to run like extremely long distances. It now deals with their oxygen carrying capacity. And you might have actually heard of people blood doping. There's another thing that's illegal in sports, is basically they're saying, let's do something to increase our red blood cells or the iron, but it's not your natural ability, because you're just adding more red blood cells to carry more oxygen. And then they just get better trained. Their muscles are more efficient, their cells are more efficient of using oxygen. Please.
So how does air pollution, like in Salt Lake, we've got the 7th worst in the nation, and we got the smoke now, how's that screw up that process, or how is that getting into the blood system?
So basically what happens is, I'm going to come back to this. Let's see here. No, it's down the way, so I'll do this first. Inside this alveolus, we have 3 different types of cells. Type 1 pneumocytes that are listed, the thin cells, there for the diffusion. Then spattered throughout there are these things called type 2 pneumocytes that make a detergent called surfactant. And surfactant functions just like a soap detergent, where you can have a bubble, but the bubble doesn't collapse. This surfactant lines the lumen, the inside of these alveoli, so every time you exhale, there's no cartilage down there. Why? We can't have cartilage because gas can't diffuse through cartilage. And so what happens then is, you then make surfactant, and this detergent that makes it so that the alveoli will not collapse. So little kiddos that are born under 34 weeks, so if you think of a baby goes to full term, which is about 40 weeks, and let's say they're born before 34 weeks, that one of the very last things to mature in an infant is these type 2 pneumocytes that make surfactant. One of the very last things. And so if they're born before that, then you start worrying about neonatal respiratory distress syndrome, where these little kiddos have a hard time breathing. Why? Because every time they exhale, their airways collapse upon themselves, and every time they breathe, you've got to reopen. So in a sense, it's just like a balloon that completely collapses and then blows up, and completely collapses and blows up. So surfactant's important. Now, to the answer to the question. The third type of cells are called macrophages. Big eaters is what they mean. They're sometimes called dust cells. And what's their purpose? They eat dust. So if you've got a lot of dust that you inhaled, if that dust, much like the X-Wing TIE fighter that you see in Star Wars that's going to try to get in the middle and they're getting blown apart, you know, and Luke is the last one at the end. When Luke makes it to the alveolus, because all the other ones that are flying down this tunnel are now sucked up against the mucus, and it makes it, he's like, I made it! And a macrophage will eat it.
Oh.
And then it eats it, and then it migrates up, and then you spit that out. And there's also why they're also called heart attack cells or smoker cells, because if you get blood, like if you have a heart attack where you get a lot of dust because you smoke, they look dark. In fact, under a microscope, they're one of the easiest things to find. You just look at them like, hey, it just looks like a bag of dust. All right, so now, basically, and for other questions, I promise we'll get to them at the end. And so just like maybe write them down, I'm making sure I leave time for that. So you take a look and you can see blue lines going out is carbon dioxide, red lines coming in is oxygen. Now in the case of conditions like pneumonia is something you get an infection. The body tries a number of things to fight the infection, and one of the things it does is it gets irritated and they make mucus. Now you take a look at when you get mucus that now lines inside there. Now this is not everything of pneumonia will look exactly like this, but the principle is there. You make mucus, it clogs these airways, and look, you now are having difficulty with gas exchange. And the other thing is you've got all these areas that look at how far, if you go in, that you're from the blood vessel. And so in a sense, you now have an infection that's happening and you're far away from the blood vessel. And so the doctor's like, all right, we're gonna try an antibiotic, but these are tough because pneumonia, if it's really bad, is hard because why? The antibiotic comes through, but the antibiotic can't get to all the infection all the time. And this is why serious cases of pneumonia can be very challenging. Here's a chest x-ray, and a chest x-ray uses these x-ray beams, and dense structures appear bright white, translucent structures like air appear dark, and then you have shades of gray in between. Insert inappropriate joke there. So what happens now when you see this right side of the lung, and on the left, you see little white speckles. Those are blood vessels and some proximal airways. But in the right, you see right down here, this white shadow. This is pneumonia in the right middle lobe of the lung. Remember how you have 3 lobes on the right and 2 on the left? Often what will happen is if you get an infection, it becomes compartmentalized. Almost like if you get a room in a big building and you get a fire, you can close what are called fire doors. So it self-contains a fire into one room and will not go into others. Often this is what happens with cancer and with pneumonias and other infections, is it becomes localized to one lobe, and in some case, one part of a lobe, a bronchopulmonary segment. And then you just keep treating, and over time, if you survive this, okay, here's another example. You're like, now you think if I get pneumonia, everyone's gonna die. A lot of people make it. What I mean is, pneumonia, if not treated, can result in a person not being able to breathe and can result in serious health problems. It does not necessarily mean they're going to die, but the older our populations get and they get pneumonia, the harder it is for them to fight infections. So this is one of the reasons, and I'll talk in a few more minutes about COVID's example of what it does to each of us if we get it, is that someone like me who's like young and healthy and relatively, when I got COVID a year ago, I felt like I had the flu for a week and a half. It was really crappy, and then I got better. After quarantine, I went back to work. Because my body's immune system is able to fight it. If you then are someone who's older and your immune system is not able to fight as much, and one of the things you get is you get COVID, and you're like, what's COVID do? This is what COVID can do. Okay? The way that it fights, and you block airways. So more on that later. Now, what roles do the pleura play? So here are your lungs, and what I want you to do now is humor me for a second, is take both your hands and put them together, okay? And take one finger and put it in your ear. I'm kidding, I just wanted to see if you do it. All right, now put your hands like this. All right, so now go like this. How does that feel? Warm. We call that friction. It feels really good when you're in Utah and it's cold and you're skiing. It's not good if your lungs do that to the inside of your ribs from the day you were born until you die. That's not good. So God's like, we got to fix this problem. We can't have that. I know. Let's just put it in a little water balloon. That's what God did. We call it the pleura. And the